Hello, everyone. This is The Sexual Catholic, and I'm your host, Dr. Mark Levand. If you're interested in broadening your understanding of sexuality and/or the sexuality-Catholicism connection, you're in the right place. Thanks for being here today. Let's get into the episode. Greetings and welcome. This is The Sexual Catholic, a podcast about matters of sexuality and how they relate to sexual health and Catholicism. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Levand. In this introductory episode, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and why I do what I do and how I got here. I'll tell you a little bit about what this podcast is not, and then what this podcast is and why this podcast is. Because there are some important reasons behind its creation that will help situate what you're about to hear in the future episodes. So to start, hello, I'm Mark Levand. I'm a sexuality educator and researcher, and I teach and write about sexuality, research, counseling, education, culture, and theology and religious studies, specifically Catholic theology and sexual ethics. My journey to this point is a long and windy road. I've worked in grocery stores, coffee shops, I did maintenance at a factory as a bike mechanic, I worked in an inpatient mental health facility, I worked as a campus minister, as an interfaith program coordinator, and as a sexual health educator. I did every single one of those jobs because I like to help people. Anything to make someone's day a little better, a little brighter, whether that's a smile at a counter, fixing their toilet or production machine, or offering bits of information to continue on with their life journey. I like to offer what I can. I started my education with 18 years of Catholic schooling, grade school, high school, college, and grad school the first time. I got a bachelor's in theology, pastoral ministry, and secondary education. And I was going to teach high school theology, and I did for a little bit. But while working in a coffee shop and in a garage as a mechanic's assistant, I got my master's in Catholic theology, and I worked in campus ministry, working with college students and the faith life on campus. This is all very good and theological. However, there seemed to be, while I was doing that work, a lack of knowledge about sexuality. When working with college students, they have lots of questions, right? And a lot of people didn't have some basic answers to some sexuality education. So I turned my study to sexual health. I began studying for a Master's of Education in Human Sexuality and a PhD in Human Sexuality Studies, where I worked in a library, I worked at a bike shop, I worked as a sexuality behavior consultant for adults with autism, and the interfaith program coordinator, where I helped student faith groups kind of organize and foster faith community on campus, and this was all faiths. I study many things in the broad world of human sexuality, but my biggest study was on how Catholic colleges and universities change around topics of human sexuality. I actually have a book coming out on that later in 2023 called Inclusion and Sexuality in Catholic Higher Education. So, I'm a trained pastoral counselor, I'm an educator, I'm a sexuality researcher. I'm an international presenter on topics related to sexuality, sometimes involving Catholicism. I'm a certified sexuality educator and supervisor, or one who trains educators through ASECT, the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And I'm really grateful for the road that brought me here and everything that makes this podcast possible. So, let's start about this podcast, what this podcast is not. As you listen, keep this in mind. This is not a stand-in for sexuality education. The U.S. does not have national standards for sexuality education, meaning that people from different states get very, very different education about sexuality. Some is really comprehensive, they have a broad understanding, and have talked about a lot of stuff. And some, or many people, have only had maybe 1 week or 1 day of sexuality education in their lives, if any at all. There are great resources for sex education like Scarlet Teen or Sex, etc., that can offer some information about a wide array of topics in sexuality. But this podcast is meant to augment, not replace, foundational basic sexuality information. This podcast is not a platform to tell people how the Catholic Church views matters of sexuality for the sake of doctrinal review, shaming people, calling them inadequate, or criticizing someone as, quote, not Catholic enough for whatever reason. This podcast is not a guide to morality and how to live your life in accordance with Catholic doctrine. Not everything in this podcast will resonate with everyone. If you find yourself being upset by the content here, turn it off. Take a break. Feel free to reflect on the reasons behind that. Different factors can make this stuff hard to listen to. Sexual trauma or religious trauma can really impact us deeply when trying to listen to material like this. Or sometimes we just get uncomfortable hearing about a new way to view something that's different than how we've always viewed it. Whatever the reason, reflect and seek safe friendship and community if it becomes too much or too uncomfortable. This podcast is not meant to convert people to Catholicism. It's for people who are trying to make sense of Catholicism, and in some ways Christianity as a whole, and how that's impacted their understanding of sexuality. Because sometimes teachings, quote-unquote teachings, may be passed down from parents or grandparents that are actually wrong and really harmful. And some of them are operationalized in very, very harmful ways. So what this podcast is, The Sexual Catholic is a reflection on many aspects of human sexuality and how they interact in our world today. We're going to cover tons of topics, from sexual shame, sexual trauma, to sexual joy, to pleasure, to ways that we understand ourselves as sexual beings. This is a reflection on sexuality knowledge and sexual health, connected to sexual science, and how we can best live as sexually healthy adults. This is not going into sex in the way that other podcasts like Sex and Psychology or American Sex might, with a lot of information and sexual science that is digested, or Come As You Are, or the Sexuality and Aging podcast, Our Better Half. But it will be an element of what we discuss. Right? Sexual education and sexuality education and sexual science are really, really important for better understanding how we are sexual people in the world. The Sexual Catholic is a look into the very Catholic connections to these ways of living out our best selves in the world. For people who are trying to make peace with their Catholicism and their understanding of sexuality, whether that be in one's sexual identity, sexual practices, intimate relationships, sexual fantasies and desires, or whatever else, this podcast is my attempt at explaining how I, a sexuality educator and researcher, look to my Catholic faith to offer helpful insights into the work that I do. We will address some aspects of Catholicism that can lead to sexual shame, and I'll offer some other Catholic lenses through which we can view the world of sexuality. Lenses that are not shame-based, but built out of a universal love. This is not a contradiction of church teaching, but it is a look into the humanity and relational realities of human sexuality, an important and necessary step in sexual ethics, for an increased dialogue and understanding in becoming what Pope Francis calls a listening church, or a church of encounter. In this case, encountering the diverse reality that is human sexuality, which we will delve into in the future episodes. Okay, Mark, why are you doing this podcast? Why does this podcast exist? Okay, so I told you I worked at a coffee shop. One day I was working away on my thesis at the time, and someone comes by, and there was a book out that I just put down. I was writing from it. I think it was Sexuality and Catholicism by Thomas Fox. someone comes up and they said, oh, sexuality and Catholicism, those are polar opposites. Those don't go together. And in the service industry, you chuckle, you laugh, and you're like, well, that's why I'm learning about it, right? And ever since then, I get people saying that all the time. A lot. And that tells us something, right? That tells us something as a people in the world, that an entire group of people are believed to think that this is incompatible with the faith. Most people believe that, and not for nothing. They've been taught that. They've been told that. They've been shamed. And what we're going to do is talk more about things like that in this podcast. People also hold a couple assumptions about being Catholic that we should probably get out of the way before getting into these other episodes. Many people assume that there's only one right way to be Catholic, and that's not true. There are many ways one can be Catholic. And you need to find what aspects of the Catholic Church you'd like to most embody and live out. Right? This is why Dorothy Day, when starting the Catholic worker movement, the bishop said, hey, actually, can you take Catholic out of the title? And she's like, no, I can't, because guess what? That's Catholic too. Or the assumption that you can't disagree with anything the Catholic Church teaches, which is also wrong. You can. There's fancy language about this, using dissent or assent or agreement or withholding assent. In what the Catholic Church says, but the Catholic Church also says this about conscience. People are not to be forced to act in a matter contrary to their conscience, nor, on the other hand, are they to be restrained from acting in accordance with their conscience. And here's the important part, especially in matters religious. It is from the Second Vatican Council, specifically Dignitatis Humanae, paragraph number 3. We all have a conscience that when it comes to matters religious, we should listen to, right? And whatever that that conscience is telling you about your faith, the Catholic Church endorses that you should listen to it. People love to throw around the term cafeteria Catholic, or people who kind of pick teachings that they like to follow and throw out the rest. And the reality is that everyone does this with their faith. People who try to convince you that they don't, it's not really that possible. People who focus on care for the homeless may not be as focused on liturgical form or how the Mass goes. Some people who are very focused on the forms of rote prayers and rituals may forget to be in communion with those who need financial support or a listening ear in what we call pastoral care in the church. Everyone is in some way or another a, quote, cafeteria Catholic or an a la carte Catholic. That's how it's designed, with an end goal of unity with God, right? There's lots of paths. And thank heavens, we have it baked into the script, the fact that we are all never going to do everything perfectly, right? That's kind of the point. And so this podcast is to help people make sense of sexuality with a little more information about sexual science and sexual health, and maybe a little bit of a different view on how Catholic teaching can help you be most truly your embodied self. So this podcast is to focus more on the positive aspects of sexuality and show that there's some good at the intersection of Catholicism and sexuality for all those skeptics out there. I said that I had a background in sexuality studies, but I started in theology and religious studies, working in ministry, helping people to navigate their faith, talking about it, working things out, thinking things through. Many therapists and doctors I know talk about the struggle their clients and patients have with their Catholic faith and topics of sexuality, orientation, becoming sexual with their partner after years of being told not to have sex, how to view sex as a good thing and not a sin, or making sense of sexual or spiritual harm caused by people from the Catholic Church. One main reason for this podcast is because I'm frequently asked by physicians and therapists for resources for positive Catholic sexuality information that is not based in shame or shoulds and should nots. Actually, when I was working in campus ministry, everyone would say, "Oh, if you want to talk about some weird sexual thing and not be judged, you should go talk to Mark." Which I thought was nice, but also not surprising coming from a bunch of Catholics. But then in my human sexuality program, when I was learning about, how to become a sex educator, my classmates and colleagues all said the same thing. "Oh, if you want to talk about a weird sexual thing and not be judged, go talk to Mark." Which I found a bit more surprising. I expected this from Catholics, but from a group of people studying to be sexuality professionals, it then dawned on me that my Catholic faith is the foundation for my care for others, the basis for how I can help others feel heard and cared for, and how I know that Catholicism and sexuality, as it exists in the world, are not incompatible, but there is a lot of misinformation and harm out there that we can address in this podcast. So why should you listen to this podcast? Well, this podcast will offer a place to learn more about sexuality and Catholicism, to help maybe unlearn some of the negative, crappy things that you've been taught about sex, like sex being bad, or having another way of looking at sexuality with kind of fresh new eyes, more language to navigate sexuality in your life. If we don't have language to talk about things, we can't describe a reality, right? Because this can lead to better sexual self-concept or how we view ourselves as a sexual person. And it can give us sexual self-agency or sexual agency or empowerment. We can be empowered to live our lives as sexual beings. In short, you can feel good about yourself as a sexual being. We're going to deconstruct some of the ingredients that make people feel bad about themselves so that we can hopefully live more fully as ourselves in the world. If you were raised Catholic, are Catholic, or considering Catholicism to be right for you, or even if you are recovering from being Catholic, this podcast will be like an exercise in thinking through sexuality with positive Catholic connections. I've had people tell me, "Mark, you work within the faith, so you can't talk to people who are trying to leave the faith." And that's not true. I've talked to a lot of people who end up understanding that maybe Catholicism isn't right for them. I understand that harm is done in the name of Catholicism. People can be severely harmed and should not stay in a position that causes more harm. I don't encourage or condone telling people they should, quote, stay Catholic if their conscience is telling them differently. This discussion is for those who want to learn more about navigating this sexuality and Catholicism connection, for you or someone you love if you're trying to figure things out. Imagine being Catholic, but with none of the exclusion and bigotry that is unfortunately often synonymous with the name. That's why this podcast exists. It's a look into very specifically the many ways that we as humans interact with the big, broad concept of human sexuality in the world. It's not clear-cut. It's messy. It's confusing. There's a lot of gray area in trying to figure out what to do when action is required of us. But hopefully, within these episodes, we can talk about the intersection in a new light that brings joy, love, self-worth, and abundance over fear, guilt, doubt, and shame. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the podcast and find something useful in the episodes to come. Thank you all for listening to this episode. If you liked what you heard or otherwise appreciated it, please subscribe and rate the podcast. If you have other thoughts or ideas for future episodes you'd like to share, please email thesexualcatholic@gmail.com. If you or someone you know would like to learn more about the work that I do, for more information, please visit www.marklevand.com. Thank you for tuning in. I hope something in today's episode was helpful, interesting, or otherwise inspiring. Have a great day.